Tomb Raider series is probably a pretty good case example of a series that has been sort of forgotten in the spans of time. Not completely so, and not necessarily to the point where nobody knows what it is anymore. It's certainly not as forgotten as some games. But for the most part, modern gamers don't seem to understand what the old Tomb Raider games were unless they were alive and playing video games in the mid-90s when the games were released. The fact is, the Tomb Raider games were pretty revolutionary for their time, and while the heights of Lara Croft's fame didn't last as long as some of us would have liked, the fact is, they have a place in gaming history, and a special place in my heart.
Tomb Raider really represents a big part of me as a gamer. It was one of the reasons I bought a PlayStation to begin with, and quite frankly, I feel like I've neglected it in a way. I've given so much attention to a lot of other series, such as Sonic, and I just haven't talked about Tomb Raider nearly as much. And I feel like I owe it, at the very least, to explain why it was so good and why it was such a big deal back in the 90s, because quite frankly, looking at the gaming community now, a lot of people don't really understand what Tomb Raider was at the time.
And that's really the reason I wanted to do this retrospective. The fact is, I'd attempted to do this before, and every time I seemed to either half-ass it or not finish it, and I really want to do it right this time. I feel like I owe it to the games, you know? I grew up with them. They deserve a little bit of praise from me. They deserve some frickin' recognition. And I'm going to do my best to give them some, at least in my small way. Now, before we get to the games, we have to talk about Lara Croft herself, what she was at the time as a character, and a certain controversy in regards to her portrayal. Yeah, we're going to talk about sexuality in video games again, just briefly.
Now, the issue of Lara Croft being a big video game sex symbol tends to overshadow the games themselves, and it's a debate that I was trying to avoid getting into, but if I'm really going to do this, it's something I need to address. Oh, hi, honey. How are you? What? You think I only like Tomb Raider for? No! I will have you know that there are more reasons, and I'm not even being sarcastic this time, that I like Tomb Raider. Fine. Just go. You'll come back. I hope.
Now, to answer the immediate question, is Lara Croft's portrayal in any of the games really a problem or overly sexual? No. The answer is no. If anyone actually played the games, and I feel like the critics haven't, you'd know that Lara is never portrayed in an overtly sexual manner. Yeah, she has some pretty unrealistic proportions, especially in the older games, but that's just a sign of the times. Keep in mind, this was also back during the time when Duke Nukem was at the height of his fame, and he objectified women to make it funny. And in fairness, I find Duke Nukem more of a parody of the concept of objectifying women, and really everything about the guy is exaggerated for laughs. But my point is that this was considered normal back then, and it really wasn't an issue until later. In addition, again, I plead with you, if you've seen my rant on sexualization of women in video games, you know my opinion on this, but what is wrong with making a woman look pretty? Is that really such a sin? Like, I don't understand this concept. And I know showing pictures of her in the older games may not mean much, but look at her in the newer ones. She is gorgeous! What is the deal? Do you not like pretty women? Is that such a problem with you? Look, her looks never, ever compromise her character. She is one of the most well-loved and respected heroines ever in video game history, and there was never a point where I felt like her character was being compromised for the purpose of sexuality. And again, maybe it's bad coming from me, after all, I'm a guy, but I've spoken to female gamers on this, and they also don't see what the big deal is either. I think people are overly sensitive about the subject.
Never understood why the idea of having an attractive female lead was such a big deal. Many argued that it portrayed a bad, example for young girls, but really, Lara never flaunted herself around at all. In fact, her sexuality is mostly ignored throughout the games. Despite her physical appearance, that's about all you got. Her actual personality, her actions, she doesn't act like a slut, I think is the best way to put it. And now some of you are probably saying, well, I think Samus Aran, she portrayed women in a much better light. My problem with Samus, as much as I love Metroid, is that Samus didn't really portray women at all at first, because you didn't even know she was a girl to begin with. Now, you could look at that a few different ways, but the fact is, Lara Croft was really the first female protagonist to come out front and center and say, yeah, I'm a woman, and I don't give a shit. And I think overall, it was a much more drastic step to introducing the idea of having female leads in gaming.
The argument of, oh, she's creating a bad example for young girls and how physical appearance is supposed to be. Well, for one, if you're trying to reach Lara Croft levels of physical appearance, good fucking luck. Second of all, if you're stupid enough to really get offended by a video game character's physical appearance, you got problems. And really, the feminist movement owes a lot to Lara because she was really the first one to break the mold in terms of having only male heroes in video games. Core Design and IDOS put her front and center in these games. I mean, look at the cover for Tomb Raider 1. She's front and center. And the fact is, she's not portrayed in an overly sexual manner. She's not in your face. She's not in a bikini. She's not in a sexual position. She's just a woman. And yes, I know, her breasts are huge. Get over it! It's not a big deal. I mean, they're big, but they're not a big deal. You know what I fucking mean! So, that's quite enough about this issue. I don't feel like discussing it anymore, because it's not the main theme of this retrospective, and like I said, it always tends to overshadow the games themselves, and that's not really fair. So, before we risk getting sucked back into a never-ending debate about nothing, let's actually talk about the games, because that's really what's important here. Because quite frankly, the first Tomb Raider game wasn't just the first game to put a female protagonist front and center. It was also a really solid 3D platformer. This type of adventure game was new at the time, and I know it doesn't look like much now, and in fairness, I will be the first to admit that the first Tomb Raider game has not aged particularly well, but like I said, at the time, this was something unique and something very, very new. We hadn't really seen anything like this prior to, and I know what you're gonna say, because the last time I even discussed this game, someone had to bring it up. Dude, in terms of adventure games, I think Ocarina of Time really nailed down... You know what? Shut up! Like, I am done with that argument, and there's two reasons for that. One, the fact that Tomb Raider came out before Ocarina of Time. Like, that is the easiest one to get away with. If you really want to get into who started adventure games, Tomb Raider was here first. Alright, if you had to compare them. But my second issue with this whole thing is that I hate comparing the games because they're not even the same kind of fucking game. Tomb Raider's a platformer, you know, exploring ancient tombs with isolated levels and with precise jumping and grabbing legends and stuff. Ocarina of Time is more of an open-world adventure game with a ton of RPG aspects. They're not even close to the same thing. So comparing the two is completely stupid. In terms of realistic 3D platforming, and in terms of having an entirely three-dimensional world to explore, Tomb Raider really revolutionized the entire concept. It really established what you could do with 3 dimensions. And to this day, there's not really that many games that did anything similar to what Tomb Raider did. Why? Because Tomb Raider allowed for a much different level of control. While the controls haven't aged too well, and actually maneuvering Lara is more like maneuvering a tank, not to the extent of Resident Evil, mind you, but still, maneuvering a tank, the fact is, you had pretty much full control over every single aspect of Lara's movements, in terms of jumping at least. I think the advent of the action button is probably one of the most amazing frickin' things ever implemented into any game, and it completely changes how you play the old Tomb Raider games. Basically, the action button does everything but jump. That's literally what it's for. It's mainly used for grabbing ledges, in fact. You literally have to press a button to tell Lara to grab onto a ledge. If you don't, she doesn't grab it. And if that sounds like it's more of a pain in the ass, it's not. It gives you a much different level of control that isn't found in a lot of other games. Most other games like this, the character's going to grab onto the ledge automatically whether you want them to or not. In this game, you had full control over whether or not they grabbed that ledge, and now if you're saying, well, why wouldn't you want them to? Well, sometimes there's a ledge lower than that one. Sometimes it's better to drop down to a lower ledge instead of grabbing the top one. It's just the feeling that you're in control of the platforming is what made Tomb Raider, I think, really special. That's not to say it was only about the platforming. There was combat, which really hasn't aged well. And in fairness, if there's anything about the old Tomb Raider games that I think has aged the worst, it's definitely the combat. It's mostly draw your guns and hold down the action button and wait for the enemies to die. There's no real cover or, strategy to it. It's just jumping around, maybe jumping around and just hoping that your enemies die. It's quite primitive, to say the least. But for the time, it was acceptable. Tomb Raider is also a puzzler, so there's a lot of different puzzles, some physics-based, some put this here based, but still a nice variety, and made for an overall interesting experience. When Core set out to develop the game, they basically wanted a female Indiana Jones, and put Lara into similar circumstances, and I think they nailed that concept down. That's what Lara Croft does. She's the Tomb Raider. She goes into ancient temples, finds ancient artifacts, explores, jumps around. It all works, and it was definitely a pretty revolutionary idea and spawned a juggernaut of a franchise, let me tell you.
So what do you think they did after they made a successful game? They made a sequel. Yep, did you see that one coming? Because that to me would be pretty obvious. That's typical reaction to success. You ride the success train. Choo choo.
And I gotta say, in terms of making a sequel, Tomb Raider 2 is probably one of the best examples of doing it. It basically took everything about the first game and made it better, which is exactly what you should do whenever you make a sequel. That's the golden rule. If you don't make something that's better than the first game, then why are you making a sequel? This isn't hard to understand. Not only did the game look better, but it also played a bit better. I'm not sure how they tweaked the controls. I'm not even sure if they changed anything with the controls, but for some reason I feel like I'm more in control than I was before. Maybe the initial controls were a little bit more clunky and they smoothed them out. I don't know. I don't care. The fact is, it's a little bit better in terms of control. The environments are also more interesting, because in the first game they were quite bland, and there's a lot of different areas to explore. And they even threw in some urban environments, which was also new. Tomb Raider 2 is still well loved by big fans of the old series, and it is considered by many to be the best Tomb Raider game out of all the old games.
But I'll be upfront, I don't consider Tomb Raider 2 to be the best out of the initial series, and there are a few things I genuinely don't like about it.
It was really down to two main things. While I do admit that the introduction of the urban environments does help spice things up a bit, I'm not really fond of playing in urban environments in a game called Tomb Raider. I preferred the ancient temples from the first game. I preferred to keep it simple. Maybe that's just my personal taste, but I wasn't really fond of all the new urban environments. In addition, the thing that really bothered me about this game was the introduction of a lot of combat. Shoot, 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 shoot. That is all I feel like I'm doing in some of these levels. I know some of the levels are based around taking on giant complexes with a bunch of enemies to fight, but good lord, enough already! Doesn't she ever run out of bullets? No! The answer is no, she doesn't. But if there's anything I truly did not like about the game, it was just the stupid amount of combat. There's just too much of this stuff. The combat system was never that intuitive, and never that interesting, even at the time. It was passable. That's all it was. Passable. No one complained back then. Nowadays, I think the game can get a little bit annoying.
But hey, you can't complain too much. After all, it was still a really great game, and it's one of the best-selling Tomb Raider games of all time. And by one of the, I mean the best-selling Tomb Raider game of all time. In fact, an article I read said it was one of the best-selling games of all time in general. So, that should tell you how big Tomb Raider was back in the day, particularly Tomb Raider 2. So, what do you think they did after Tomb Raider 2? You ready for this? Because you'll never guess what they did. They made a Tomb Raider 3. I know. I just blew your mind, didn't I?
Tomb Raider 3, as you'd expect, was the follow-up to Tomb Raider 2, introducing mostly the same kind of gameplay, with different environments and a different story.
And I'll be honest about Tomb Raider 3, I genuinely, as much as I hate to admit it, I hate this game. Just throwing it out there.
Now, I'm sure many of you are asking, well, why, Darkness? It looks about the same as Tomb Raider 2. And yeah, that's kind of part of the problem. It feels more like an expansion of Tomb Raider 2, and doesn't really do anything different from the previous game. The only thing that's really different, that I really noticed, is that the level design is way, way, way worse. Like, some of these levels are just genuinely confusing, and it's one of the few Tomb Raider games where truth be told, I get flat out lost a lot. Now, the old Tomb Raider games tend to be a little bit disorienting, but not like this. I just can't get into this game. And I'm not saying they didn't do anything new with it. I mean, the visuals are about the same as Tomb Raider 2's, but they added the ability to crawl and sprint. Woo-hoo. Other than that, the story isn't nearly as good as 2, or 1, and I just don't like it. I mean, it's not bad, it's really not, and I can't really hate on it too much, because technically speaking, there's nothing really, truly, honest-to-God wrong with it besides the level design, but I just don't like it.
But hey, maybe I'm being too hard, maybe my standards are being a bit too high, but I just can't get past the level design in Tomb Raider 3. It's just not as good as the rest of the games. Is it bad? No, absolutely not. but I do consider it one of the weaker Tomb Raider games.
Tomb Raider 4 would follow up Tomb Raider 3, since while 3 wasn't nearly as good as 2, even by most people's standards, it still sold well enough to warrant another sequel. After all, Lara Croft was still a pretty dominant figure at this point, so continually making sequels made a lot of sense. But right away, we knew Tomb Raider 4 was going to be something a little bit different, something really special. It wasn't called Tomb Raider 4, for one. It was called Tomb Raider The Last Revelation, the first game in the series to not actually have a number after it, because they felt like confusing everybody and not having a consistent number. So I'm not going into that topic. But still, it was a pretty foreboding title now that you think about it, and there would be a reason for that. It happens to be my favorite Tomb Raider game out of the original series, and it exceeded all my expectations when I first played it.
And I tell you what, going in, my standards were set really high, because I had seen a trailer on the Pizza Hut demo disc. You remember those things? Yeah, there was a trailer for this game, and I don't know why, to this day, because looking at it now, the trailer's kind of half-assed in a way, but it got me so pumped for this Tomb Raider game because it looks fantastic.
This trailer set me off. I had to play this game. It just isolated every bit about the game that I thought I would enjoy. And the music, I don't know, it just sounds badass. Okay, leave me alone. The actual game would prove to be a lot different from previous installments, doing everything the old games did, but a lot better, in my opinion.
And you know, a lot of people actually don't like The Last Revelation. A lot of Tomb Raider fans don't like it, for a variety of reasons. But I've actually listened to the reasons listed about this game, and the reasons that people don't tend to like this game are, for the most part, what's the word I'm looking for? Stupid.
I've heard a lot of complaints about The Last Revelation, but the vast majority of them are really, really petty. Like, really, really petty. You don't understand the level of nitpicky. Like we're talking Sonic has green eyes levels bullshit here. Okay, let me try to explain this. For one, I've heard complaints about the inventory system not being like the old games, and it's very similar, it just looks different. What's the big fucking deal? I've also heard a complaint that there's no Lara's Mansion in this game, which basically the reason why people were mad about this is that the previous 3 games all had the option to visit Lara's Mansion and explore. Except the first game, you couldn't explore then. But in 2 and 3, you could explore the entire mansion and unlock certain secrets then. It was almost like its own game on its own. Some players even saying that they spent more time exploring the mansion than they did playing the actual game. Its absence, I understand, may be a tad bit disappointing, but it's definitely not a game breaker. It's not really that big of a deal at the end of the day, as long as the core game, which is outstanding, is good. So I'm not understanding why that was such a big goddamn issue. I've also heard complaints that there are less weapons and less vehicles than in Tomb Raider 3, but considering the entire game is spent in Egypt and follows a more flowing narrative, I feel like they just didn't want to bog down the game with too much inventory. And that leads into another complaint, which is, oh, the whole game is spent in Egypt, and yeah, I kind of understand that, because the previous games had you going to all different places around the world, but considering the level variety, and considering that Egypt is predominantly a desert, and they had level variety, I'm not complaining, because the point of the game was to be an isolated adventure, one that focused on a certain area of the world, and explored every nook and cranny of it. There's a lot to like about that, and I gotta say, if you're gonna set a game called Tomb Raider in one location, on the top of the list, there should be Egypt. I mean, really? Why wouldn't you? It's by far the most obvious and the most appropriate choice. So, another complaint that I don't consider that big of a deal. Plus, I hate desert levels, so the fact that this game makes me happy, that says a lot. There's just so much about this game that I love, that it's hard for me to focus on one thing. For one, the game looks way better visually than the previous titles. The graphics went through a significant overhaul, and Lara is looking more gorgeous than ever before. And I know, it doesn't look that good by today's standards, but this was Sony PlayStation we're talking here. In addition, the levels are just so well designed, like the exact opposite of Tomb Raider 3. Things actually seem to flow better. I actually feel like I'm exploring an actual tomb that ancients actually built, rather than before where it seemed like, oh, you put this on this because the game designers said so. Here things actually make sense in a way. It's hard to explain what I mean by that, I know, but I just find everything to be more in place rather than before where it was set up just to make a game. I feel like I'm actually exploring a tomb that somebody built, rather than a level somebody designed. You know what I mean? I know I touched on the level variety is really good before, but I need to explain that bit. There's just more than just tombs here, and more than sand. Thank God there's more than sand. There's driving levels, there's tombs obviously, there's a train level which was really cool back in the day, there's a few urban levels thrown in for good measure. It just feels like one of those games that has something for everybody. The storyline, also in addition, is really well written. This is probably one of the best narratives in any of the Tomb Raider games, especially the ones back in the day, where the narrative wasn't exactly front and center, and it was more about just playing the game. Here, though, the narrative is actually a pretty important part of the experience. And I know I've been talking up the game as being awesome this whole time, but I'll be the first to admit it's got a few problems. My main complaint is the second half of the game. The second half of the game just gets really confusing. There are some parts of the game that go more open-worldy with it, where you can go to different areas, and you have to do some backtracking. You can get lost pretty easily, and it definitely results in some confusing situations. It's not like Tomb Raider 3, where I was confused basically all the time. It's just sometimes you get lost, and you end up wanting to restart the level. This is a problem because of another complaint, and a complaint that a lot of people have with the game that I'm willing to admit is kind of a big deal. That complaint being that there's absolutely no level select in the game at all. Considering the previous games had this function, this is kind of an issue. Especially considering that there are times in this game where you genuinely want to restart the level to start with a clean slate. To just start over. Just, start from scratch and go back to the beginning of the level and redo everything to try to figure out where you messed up. The game just doesn't let you do that. At all. At all. The previous games had this function. Why doesn't The Last Revelation? This isn't hard. And compounding the problem, there's an intro tutorial level. One that you can't skip. Now, in fairness, the story in the tutorial level is a pretty important part of the story in the rest of the game. But still, if you want to restart the game and you have to play through the tutorial level over again, it can be pretty annoying. Especially considering people that played this game, a lot of times, played the previous Tomb Raider games. They already know how to play a Tomb Raider game. We don't have to play the tutorial. See, the reason why the mansion was present at all in the previous games is predominantly to be the tutorial. So forcing the tutorial front and center in the beginning of the game, while it does present a pretty important story element, is still really frustrating. And then that's compounded by the fact that you can't skip over it, because there's no level select. Great. But still, Tomb Raider The Last Revelation is a freaking awesome game. But the ending proved to be a sad one. Lara ends up caught in a cave-in after saving the world from Armageddon, basically, and Werner von Croy, her old mentor finally released of a dark god's influence, tries to save her and fails. It was definitely a pretty sad ending.
It may have been a sad way to send the series off, and I completely understand that part of it, but, I think it was a worthy end. It was very well written. It wasn't a slap in the face, in my mind. Depressing, sure, but overall, it was such a good narrative that I genuinely would have been okay if the series ended here. Of course, nobody can leave well enough alone, but I will save the next games for a later date. This is the end of Part 1. Next part, we cover the low point of Lara Croft's career, and take a brief revisit to a game that I already reviewed that is by far the worst Tomb Raider game ever made. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.
Be careful, Lara. I fear there are things in the vaults man was not meant to see.
I'm not a man, Jean.
Hey you guys, what's up? It's another end slate thing. I hope you're all enjoying this Tomb Raider retrospective, actually, because I'm genuinely putting my heart into working on this one. I actually literally just got done editing most of it together, this first part. Like, as I speak, I literally just got to the end. That's what I do. Whenever I get to the end of all my main edits, before I go back and add all little stuff, like little pictures and little fade-in effects and stuff like that, I do this. I do the end slate, so I get that done and out of the way. So,
Yeah, I'm actually really tired right now. I'm supposed to be at my girlfriend's house, but I'm busy working on this for you people. It's for you and for me. It's something I really wanted to do. Like no joke. This is actually something serious. So if you actually watch to the end of this, I really appreciate you taking the time, because Tomb Raider as a franchise, much like Sonic, means a lot to me as a gamer. There's a lot of sentimental value. It's more than just nostalgia. There's actually an emotional attachment. You ever play a game like that where you just get so into it, you know, it transcends just a video game. I think most hardcore gamers have at least that one franchise that means that much to them. And with me, it's Sonic and Tomb Raider mainly. There's a few other games like that, but this one in particular, you know. But yeah, Enslate. Yeah, if you want to watch other videos, maybe. There's one down there, there's one down there. I don't even know which ones I'm going to put on here. They may not even be reviews. They may be rants. I may throw some other crap in here. But there is something new you may have noticed. If you look to that direction, or is it that direction? I don't know. I'm putting it on one of these sides. I'm putting a little icon for like Twitter and stuff. I'm going to put that there because everyone else does it. Not that I use Twitter that often, but it's there, in case you care at all. It is there, it is present. You have yourself a nice friggin' day, and I'm gonna go get some food.